We're going to turn this morning to verses 8 through 12 in Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to take a first look at Abraham and Sarah. They'll come up again later in the chapter. If you remember, the key to chapter 11 is verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And as I said when I preached on that, that's a puzzling verse. What does it mean immediately when you read it? Well, I believe God knew it would puzzle you. And so you've got a whole chapter of living illustrations of what it means. We've seen Cain and Abel. We've looked at Noah. Today, we look on to that great man of faith called Abraham. And I think I'm going to cover the whole chapter under one title, Living the Faith. Living the Faith. You want to know what faith looks like? Have a look here at these individuals, and then from them have a look down through history at God's people in every generation, including our own. Because this chapter shows us most particularly that faith is not theoretical. Faith is very practical. I went beyond myself last night as I was trying to think of an introduction, and what came into my head was the phrase theoretical physicist. You know, when I thought about it, I wasn't even sure what it meant. So out comes good old Wikipedia. And what's a theoretical physicist? Well, it went on and waffled for ages. But it came to a practical example. A man called Robert Oppenheimer. Some of you will know who he was. He was the theoretical physicist who came up with the idea of the atomic bomb. He was then commissioned to see it become a reality. And at that point, his theory became practice. He saw the horror of what it actually did. He resigned his work and then spent the rest of his life trying to undo it. But his theory had practical effects. And I want to suggest to you that theory is actually useless until it's tested in the laboratory of life. It's one thing to say, I have faith, but we're entitled then to say, show me it. And this chapter has many examples. In fact, that verse in James comes to mind where it says, the devils believe. They've got faith. And even they show that they have it. Why? Because they tremble. Faith is practical. It has legs. It touches the reality of our world through our lives. And that's exactly what you see on time after time throughout this chapter. The life of Abraham as described here, and Sarah, his wife, gives me three subheadings. Faith is practical in that it shows in obedience. It equips us to wait. And it enables us to believe in a final good and glorious outcome. So it's obedient, it's waiting, and it's believing. That's how you define faith. Faith is the substance, the reality of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I was thinking too of another illustration that might help the children. Christmas time's coming. You make Christmas lists. You give them to your mum and dad, or grandma and granddad are often involved there nowadays. And you tell them what you like, and then you have to wait and wait and wait. Do they tell you sometimes you need to be good if you're going to get a Christmas present? Us parents will use any means possible to get well-behaved children. And if you're naughty, you won't get a Christmas present. So what you're doing while you're waiting for Christmas is living by faith. It controls who you are and how you behave. Now that's just a very poor example of what we're looking at in this chapel, in this chapter. We're both in the chapel and the chapter. That's what we're looking at in this passage. And I hope if you forget everything else I've said this morning, you'll read this chapter with that view. People often call them the heroes of faith, and there is a sense that is true, but it tends to exalt the Ben, doesn't it? It tends to exalt the person. I want to suggest to you that these people themselves, in their humility, wouldn't want you to do that. They would want you to see how believing God's promises transform their lives, and say to you, if you want to see my faith, look at my life. James, in fact, very helpful. Faith without works is dead. It's not just to be theory. It needs to be practice. And the first practice that comes about is obedience. If you look at verse 8 of chapter 11, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Some people want to say that faith is blind. Of course it's not. But it sometimes will take us into places that we don't know what's going to happen or how it's going to work out. It will call us to trust God, even when our senses challenge us as to whether we actually can. So faith shows, first and foremost, in how you respond to God's command. That's how you become a Christian, is it not? You hear the gospel, and the gospel doesn't come to you as advice. It's a command. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. Is how Paul talked to the Philippian jailer, isn't it? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes should not perish. So the Christian, by the grace of God, has been given a new heart. We've seen that in Hebrews. And through that new heart is given the ability to trust and to follow Jesus as their Saviour. But that's only the beginning of a lifetime's experience. You cannot go back and be born again a second time, but you can in fact renew your commitment to God every day by being reminded of his word and his truth, and then by his grace committing yourself to following him wherever he goes. There's another verse which I love that it stays in my mind a lot in the book of Galatians. Faith works through love. He loves me, and by his grace I love him. It shows. I made a promise to a young lady in Ryedale Parish Church 49 and a half years ago. I'm still surprised that she still puts up with me. But it was an act of faith, wasn't it? For richer for poorer, in sickness and health. And by God's grace, here we are. But it doesn't happen by accident. It's a day-by-day commitment to follow where God has led us and to obey God in every way that he gives us the grace and the ability to do so. So that faith is primarily shown in obedience. We used to sing a chorus when we were in church in Falkirk. Obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. And then we used to spell it out, and it got a bit monotonous. You know, these children's choruses can be hard at times, but it's always stuck with me. Obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. Following Christ. Take up your cross. Follow me. It's a call to obedience. And yet we seem to have lost that emphasis in Christianity in modern time. We live in a world where people do and don't do whatever pleases them. And yet when you read your New Testament, you kind of get away from the fact that the gospel was not only a message of salvation, it was a call to obedience. Acts chapter 6 verse 7 is just one example. Then the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith. Were obedient to the faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. Faith is how we respond to God. It's how we say to God, I believe what you're saying. I know enough about you, your character, your person, your love for us. And now I know I can trust you. And by your grace, I'm going to follow you. Faith is best seen in Abraham. He's used as an example over and over in the Bible, is he not? Chapter 6 of the book of Hebrews, chapter 4 of the book of Romans, chapter 3 of the book of Galatians, all point us back to Abraham and his faith and its result. Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. But you go on from that. Abraham believed God, it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he left Ur of the Chaldees and everything he was familiar with and went where God was sending him. He would appear to have been a relatively wealthy man. I was tempted to take you back and read Genesis 12 at this point, but that would take a long time. I'd like you to read it on your own when you go home later. He was part of a prosperous family, an effectual family. One of my books said that his father, Terah, was a 9th generation descendant of Noah's son Shem. He came from a good line, and yet God had a plan for him. And so when he heard God speak, when he heard God call, he followed. He went out, and here's the bit where faith gets difficult, not knowing where he was going. We like to know where we're going and what we're doing. You've probably got your next week planned out to some degree at least. I could ask you what you're doing on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and with some flexibility you would have a good pattern. But it is nerve-wracking, isn't it? When you don't know where it is you're going, but you do know that God has called you to do it. It's 32 years ago since God called us to come to Pickering. I had never heard of Pickering in my whole life. No idea even where it was. And yet here we are 32 years later saying, praise the Lord. His faithfulness and his goodness has been shown year after year after year. And by his grace we intend to carry on throughout life. These are the words of Genesis 12, 1-3. Now the Lord had said to Abraham, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And if I'm right, he had no children at that point. He's not a young man. But he's got a God in heaven whom he knows and through whom he receives grace. He shows us that faith some years later, Genesis 22, when he takes his promised son up the mountain and is ready to offer him as a sacrifice. What always intrigues me is that when he left his servants at the bottom of the mountain, he says, I and the lad must go and make sacrifice, and when we come back. He believed, you see, that if Isaac was to die, he would have to rise from the dead, because all God's promises were in him. A picture of the coming Lord Jesus, the seed of Abraham. Abraham had this promise that he would be the father of a great nation. Run your eye down to verse 11. We'll come back to it by God's grace. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age. Genetically, she was unable to conceive children. But that's never been a problem for God. The God who does the impossible for those people of his who will take him at his word. So Abraham stands here to call us to a life of obedience. Obeying what God says to us in his word. Obeying what God lays on our heart by his Spirit. And I hope even as you sit there and think about it, you're thinking how tough it is. The natural man doesn't receive the things of God. And even as children of God, we have enough of the old man about us to prefer to lie in our bed and take things easy. It's a challenge which needs to be refreshed day after day. In Luke's Gospel, the Saviour says, take up your cross daily. A cross, remember, is not a beautiful piece of jewellery. It's a Roman execution gallows. So the Christian was to follow Christ and know it would mean death to their own plans and priorities and life to the one that God has laid before him. As I said, we live in a pick and choose generation. So many people pick the bits of Christianity they want, so that when there's a birth or a marriage or a death, they want religion. That's not New Testament Christianity. New Testament Christianity is a call to follow God wherever he leads you. And it won't be always a smooth path. And it won't just be things outside you that will cause you a problem. You'll cause yourself problems. If you had time to read the story of Abraham, you'll find he slips up twice, very badly, by lying about who Sarah is. Once I could maybe work with, but he goes back and does it again. What an encouragement for this old man, if not for you. The life of faith involves being ready to come to God and saying, I can't do this on my own. Remember Paul's words, I can do all things? He doesn't stop there. Through God, who strengthens me. The Christian's call to a life of faith is not just a call to a life of obeying rules and regulations. It's a call to a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, which then becomes how we live, why we live. I like Peter's words. He says, be ready to give a reason to anybody who asks you for an explanation of the hope that's within you. I've murdered the verse, but you know where I am. What is it that people are going to see? Faith. They're going to see that you march to a different drummer. They're going to see that your priorities are not simply set by your own preferences, your partner's preferences, your society's preferences. You have an ear to heaven. God speaks through his word. And when he calls, we say, yes, Lord. Take me forward. Do you have that kind of faith? It's not something you can muster in your own strength. I've already referred to the fact that it needs to be a supernatural work of God which initiates faith in your life and brings you through that faith into a saving relationship with him through Jesus Christ. And so if you're not a Christian, the first thing you need to do is cry out for help. And the condemnation of our generation is, of course, it doesn't. The self-sufficient generation. I can do all things without God because I don't need him. Oh, that my life would be the kind of life that would make people say, what makes you tick? Why do you give your time, your effort, your money, your talents to serving God? Because I long to tell them it's because of his love for me and the grace that he's given me, that I might be able one day to live with him forever and ever. I came across this little poem. It really captures the whole thing. It said, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one would walk with me than merely show the way. The eye's a better pupil and much sharper than the ear. Fine counsel can confuse me, but example's always clear. The lectures you deliver may be very wise and true, but I'd rather get my lesson by observing what you do. By observing what you do. Faith is first of all obeying. It's secondly believing. It's waiting, isn't it? It says here in verse 9 and 10, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Abraham's obedience shows his faith. But that obedience took him to what we now call the land of Israel and gave him a place to live there, but it never gave him any part of the land. It is true, he bought the little cave at Machpelah to be a cemetery where his wife would lie, but he never actually owned any of the land apart from that little bit. So he was and is a pilgrim and a stranger, living in God's world, waiting for the culmination of God's promises. And that again takes me back to verse 1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. The evidence, it shows that we know about things not seen, like the child who's waiting for that favourite Christmas gift. Waiting for that call on Christmas morning. You can get out of bed now. They're usually up long before that. And then they go and tear off the paper. They have to wait. And one of the things that this chapter teaches us so well is that faith is a call to wait. To wait for the final and complete fulfillment of God's promises. And that's in a world where everybody wants results yesterday. Believers need to wait, to believe that God's timing is perfect. It occurred to me, imagine if Abraham had received the kingdom right back then and there was nothing else in our Bible except Abraham because the world had finished. Imagine the things that we would not know about and the people that we would not know about. No Abraham, no Moses. No Abraham, no Joshua. No Abraham, no Samuel, David. We go down these great characters of the Old Testament and we enjoy reading of them and listening to the stories and learning from their experience. Worse still, no Jesus. And so God asks us to recognize that He has a plan which is working on His timetable, not ours. I like to think the longest any of us have to wait to see it realized is a lifetime. There's almost a blessing in the fact that we don't live on for hundreds of years. All too soon we'll enter into the joy of the Lord. But the planet itself is being addressed by the living God who has a plan to save a multitude without number from every tribe and tongue and nation. And that was intimated to Abraham, wasn't it, from his seed. And in the great work of the God who is not willing that any should perish, in the great work of God, He calls His people to be patient. He calls His people to be obedient, to do what He's told them to do, to live to His glory, and then to realize that the results might not be on your timeline. That there might be great work to go on. I'm reading a book which I picked up a couple of weeks ago, and it's, the history of the gospel in England. Fascinating book. I'm glad I picked it up. It wouldn't have been an automatic choice of mine. But it's tracing not just the history of Christianity in England, but the history of the gospel in England. And one of the shocking things I was reading just a couple of nights ago was at the beginning of the century is right, 18th, end of the 17th century, this country was as bad as it is today. We often think we're living in terrible days, and I think we are. But when you go back, and the part I read last night just to check I wasn't off the wall, told me that the Prime Minister, the Prince of Wales, And there was another character named, were all living immoral lives. That Christianity was considered to be a fiction. Does it sound familiar? God has a purpose. He has a people to save. I can say that with complete confidence. Why and how? Because when He's finished saving, Christ is coming back. The gospel will be preached to the ends of the earth. Then Christ will come. And the very reason then that the Christian church continues today is because God has not yet brought all of His children into the fold. There are still sheep that He's out looking for. And this is the bit I really like. He wants to involve us. You ever think about it? God could do it all without you and me. But He asks us to make it a matter of prayer. What's prayer about? Well, that would take too long to explain. Just one point. It's us agreeing with God. Inverted promise, isn't it? God, you've said. We were looking at it on Thursday night, Wednesday night. Give him no rest. Isaiah chapter 58. No, chapter 64. Until he rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem. Give him... God, you don't need me to be involved. I don't need to, but I want to. So God's method of spreading His good news is by having people of faith living in a world full of sin. That's where Abraham was. That's exactly how Abraham dwelt. I've left my notes for a bit. Terrible stuff. But in actual fact, some of the promises that were given to Abraham wouldn't be realized for 500 years. He was told he would have children, and he was told he would go for 430 years into captivity. And of course, he never even physically lived to see it. Listen to some of the words from Genesis 12:7. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. You notice the two sides of that. God said, Abraham worships. God said, Abraham bows the knee. And that's the call in our life. Chapter 15:13. Then God said to Abraham, know certainly that your descendants will be stranger in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. That's when Joseph takes the people down into Egypt. Acts chapter 7. Stephen on his deathbed. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. That's faith. What enables a believer to live in this world waiting for what God's going to do? It's there in verse 10. He waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He waited for the city. Most people, you see, imagine that they've got to build their own cities. They've got to set up their own kingdoms. And they've got to fight everybody to make sure that they're safe to do it. We're told that Abraham lived in that land as a wanderer. Because he knew there was more to life than the things of this world. And surely that's where you and I as Christians come on board. He knew that the mess that had begun in the Garden of Eden would be reversed. The promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent was passed on to him, and that through his seed all the nations would be blessed. David would receive the same promise, that one of his seed would always sit on the throne. And then along comes Jesus, fulfilling them all. How do you keep going? Because you're looking up. Looking forward. Wait a minute, hasn't he just said that in verse 1? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The glorious thing about being a Christian is we don't know every detail of what will happen in life, but we know how it will finish. We know where it's going and when it will stop. It's not pie in the sky when you die, as the world scoffs. It's a promise from the living God, which is absolutely money in the bank. And it's confirmed to us day after day when we walk in obedience and trust Him for what's to happen in the future. That word waited in verse 10 means to eagerly expect. Am I right in thinking that that's kind of missing today in Christianity? We want people saved so that they can have a happy life. I do. But I want people saved so that they will have a life they enjoy in fellowship with God in anticipation of the full glory of that. When we see Him, we will be like Him. Does that figure in my thinking? Does that wake me up in the morning and say, wow, Lord, another opportunity to live with you? Waiting for the day, expecting it to come. Waiting for the fulfillment of the promise. Have you read Revelation 21 recently? Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. The Bible finishes with a city which will have the freedom to dwell in God's presence forever. And so I put it to you, dear friends, that faith is obeying, faith is waiting because you're absolutely persuaded it's happening. I go back to these poor kids again. I hope you don't torment them with Christmas, but it sort of keeps them going, doesn't it? Or if you're going on holiday, were you looking forward to coming to Yorkshire? Were you excited to be here? It's a beautiful place, I can guarantee it. And it's that anticipation which sort of keeps you going. Have you got your case packed yet? Have you planned your route? I don't think those are accidents. I think God has built into our lives all these sort of helps and indicators to remind us that we're not meant to be permanently here. We're looking for a city like Abraham. Now, the Scripture is clear and nobody can tell you the date when it's going to happen. But it is to be in your life. Again, when I was a young lad as a Christian in my early 20s, I associated with some folks who had a great emphasis on the second coming. And they used to have a little calendar which they gave out every year, and at the bottom of each month was perhaps today. And that really did stimulate us when we were young. And I go back to that thought often, perhaps today. If Christ were to come today, would it disappoint you? Would you be saying, but I never got on that train in Pickering? If men can invent steam locomotives like that, eye has not seen, nor heart conceived what God has prepared for them that love Him. Oh, dear friends, are you living with an eye to the end? Are you living with a view to glory? And that's where I need to challenge the unbeliever. What on earth keeps you going? If I wanted to, I could be powerfully negative about this world. Look at the mess our politics are in. 1 million people apparently marched in London yesterday, wanting their way to be the way we go. Or look across the seas to what's happening between Turkey and Syria. I didn't get time to follow it up, but I think they've used gas weapons. And little children have been burnt with phosphorus and other horrific... We went to war in Iraq for that reason. And there weren't any in Iraq. this week in the news, reading about churches in Algeria being closed by the government. Then you need to look at all the adverts on the TV, isn't it? Just give me £2. We'll get water for somebody. We'll get food and shelter for somebody else. You see, while we do live in the most prosperous part of the world, even here it's not entirely pleasant. What are you living for? Just to be put in a box in the ground? Or taken to another place and set on fire? That's where everybody goes, and if you're not a Christian, that's all you've got. I exhort you, therefore, ask God to give you the faith you need to believe. And don't give him any peace until you've got it. Because when you pass away, dear friends, you lose everything you've worked for, except the penalty for your sin. My last point, and in a few minutes. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she had judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude. Oh, my time's gone, isn't it? Innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. We can't stop without just picking up here, you see. Remember the story in the Old Testament when the angel told Abraham that his wife was going to have a child and she's 99 years old? It says Sarah laughed. Wouldn't you? It's impossible. Who are you kidding? And then God asks Abraham, why is your wife laughing? And she denies that she had laughed at all. But it became a reality. Because rather than going with her own senses and feeling, rather than going with the science of the day, her and Abraham were enabled to create a new life. A boy called Isaac. You know what the word Isaac means? Laughter. I'm sure they chuckled, as many parents do when they think about bringing up their kids. Remember when we thought God couldn't do this? How was she able to go through it? Because, like Abraham, her eyes were set on the city, but even more significantly here, she judged him faithful who had promised. When you have to make a choice between what God says and what I think, or she thinks, or he thinks, who gets the final word? Who gets the final? It's not easy. I don't want to pretend that you just click your fingers and it happens. I'm sure that Sarah, after having been told she was going to get pregnant, really had some apprehension about the whole thing. Can we really do this? Can we really trust God for that? Will we try? No, we don't do that anymore. But then somewhere in there, just the light broke through. God has said it. We better trust God and not just our own fickle imaginations. And so here we have a living picture of faith. If you want to know what faith is, read verse 1, but don't stop there. Keep reading. And as you look at every individual in this chapter, you're drawn back to this great truth that faith is about obeying God, believing the gospel, living the gospel. Faith is about waiting because you know that God has plans for the end of the world and plans for you in it now that you're a child of God. And then as you live in this world, be ready to look to God who might call you to do something which really and truly you can hardly get your head round. When Hudson Taylor was speaking at F.B. Myers Church, he opened his Bible and he says, "Friends, I will give you the motto of my life." And so he turned to Mark chapter 11 and verse 22, which says, "Have faith in God." The disciples are on the sea, the storm's raging, and Jesus says to them, never mind the waves. What? Never mind the boat. Never mind the circumstances. Trust God. Apparently the original language can be translated, have the faith of God, which Hudson Taylor said meant, reckon on God's faith to you. And he went on, all my life has been so fickle. Sometimes I could trust, sometimes I could not. But when I could not trust, then I reckoned that God would be faithful. The one that's promised won't disappoint us. The one that's promised will go on to fulfill all that he's promised. Thomas Langton, those who are regular here will know he was a local Methodist evangelist 120 years ago. He was in fact a farrier. That means he went round the moors attending to the animals and also provided livery and saddles. But he was converted by God's grace, too long a story to tell, and became a very well-loved preacher. A very busy man as a preacher for God. And as he was preaching, one day he was going home to his mum and dad. He supported them in the village of Kepwick. And he was convicted that he should by living by faith, trusting God for the future. And as he was wrestling with that in his heart, he spoke out loud apparently and talked to God about it. And then he opened his Bible, Psalm 37 verse 3. I thought I had it written down. I'll leave you to look at it. Psalm 37 verse 3. And from that point he went on to live by faith. He was coming home after 8 weeks of preaching around the moors and little chapels without a penny in his pocket. And Satan said to him, it says in the book, well, Mr. Langton, where's your faith now? Have you ever heard that message, that question? Where's your faith now? Where's your 37th Psalm now? And of course, Thomas was troubled. He's walking through the moors and he calls on a man called Mr. Moore. Under God, Thomas had been used in seeing the conversion, I think it was 13 of his children. Mr. Moore says, we were just thinking about you last night. How are you getting on? How are you managing to provide for your family? And Thomas piously said, God provides. Ah, well, he says, here's a sovereign for you. And by the way, my wife has another. So you can imagine how he was going down the road now, floating on air. Sovereign was a lot of money 120 years ago. He meets another man called Mr. Attlee, it says in the book. Thomas, we were just wondering how you were getting on, and we were talking last night in bed. My wife says she's got a sovereign for you, and here's another. He went home that day to find that living by faith was exactly what God called him to do, trusting him completely. When he got home, he found that somebody had delivered a bag of flour to the house and some potatoes as well. And then Thomas went on to live, preaching around these places for many years afterwards, living by faith. Well, you might not be a preacher, but even if you have a regular job, I put it to you, you're still called to live by faith. It's not the paycheck at the end of the month that keeps you going. It's not the pension fund that you saved up for that keeps you going. The banks could go broke. The fact is, God makes all things work. He's providing for you. He's provided for you. And he expects you then to go on and live by faith, to use the resources, your health, your life, your wealth, your skills, as one who's looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. As one who believes that God does the impossible and that he will indeed provide all that you need to bring you through this life and into his presence. That's living by faith. Amen.